For this Christmas I decided to build some cutting boards as presents. There will be 3 videos of my builds, and the first one is a guitar-shaped cutting board that I built for my brother. He is also into rock and heavy music like myself and also plays a bit of guitar himself, so I thought that this might be an interesting one. I ordered the template that I'm using from Designs by Donny Woodworking, linked in the description, which made this quite an easy build in the end. I'm using walnut, ash and purple heart, and like all builds, also this one starts by milling the wood. I first cut the pieces roughly into correct sizes, then did the usual process of jointing, planing and finishing with a table saw. I also cut the small strips of ash with my table saw, no need to make it too complex and trying out with a bandsaw, which is a bit inaccurate, at least my cheap and not so good bandsaw that I have. Technically this was a simple build, since the template that I bought made the later part of using my router very easy. But I really like how it turned out, and I hope that my brother will like it and put it into good use. The final board is a sturdy one because I kept the pieces quite thick, around 4.5 centimeters or 1.8 inches. I prefer a cutting board that's heavy enough so that it doesn't want to move around when it's being used. As this is not an end grain cutting board, I only needed to glue up the pieces once. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm also in the process of building more cutting boards for my other brother and my mother. Those will be slightly different in style, and hopefully I can get that video out within a week or so. I'm also building a few boards for myself. One will be an end grain brick style board, which obviously requires 2 different glue ups, so there might be a bit more technical challenges with that one to get everything aligned properly. But as mentioned, this was an easy one, and anyone with fairly standard tools could try something like this. Router is of course something that's needed, and the bandsaw made the rough cutting slightly easier, as you can see. With bandsaw I cut close to the line but not to the final measurements. That's what the template and router are for, which I'm using after this phase. I had the wider blade attached, so I couldn't do the turns like I would have been able if I had changed to a smaller blade, but this worked just fine. Just needed to do a bit more extra cuts to get the pieces cut out close enough to the line. Before using double-sided tape to attach the template and use my router with huge flush trim bit to get this to final measurements, I needed the board to be flat, and that's where my drum sander comes into picture. I use it quite rarely, but with cutting boards, especially end grain ones, it's a super useful machine to have. In no time at all, it made the board nicely sanded and flat on both sides. Then it was time to use this rather big flush trim bit for the first time. I've earlier used smaller ones, and with this kind of thick boards I've needed to use the router from both sides. But now with this new bit I was able to run it through the whole board with one go, and it left amazingly smooth surface. It really didn't need much sanding after. I also have to give kudos to Designs by Donny on this acrylic template. It's very nicely built and thick enough, so it makes using it very easy, and I was able to run through the entire board without stopping even once to adjust anything. As this router bit is big and heavy, I didn't run my router with full speed. I took it down to roughly 50% of maximum, and that seemed to work out fine. Safety first, as always. There was just a small part where the walnut chipped a bit, but that was an easy one to fix with the traditional wood glue and sawdust mixture. Usually with cheaper router bits I've had a few more areas to fix, but as mentioned, this one really performed well for me, so really happy with the purchase. So as you can see here, this was the small thing I needed to fix, and after it dried I used my spindle sander to quickly run through the edges, even though the surface was almost perfect after just using the router. But it only took a few minutes to do this, so why not? If there were some small imperfections, they were cleaned out quickly. I decided to put a small round over on this cutting board, and at the time I didn't find my sanding mat, so you can see the board wanted to move a bit when I did it. But with the handheld router this wasn't really a big issue, but I wouldn't recommend doing this without something to create a bit of friction between the board and your assembly table. Or find some way to attach it so it will not move. Now the board is almost complete, only sanding and finishing left to be done. I usually sand my cutting boards up to 240 grit, which is what I did here as well. I started from 80 grit, which is the same grit than I have on my drum sander, but I do believe that the random orbital sander makes a bit better end result, so I resand it with 80, then 120, 180, and I hand sanded the edges and the round over with the same grits. This is an important part. Before the final grit, 240 in my case, I always spray water on my pieces to lift the grain and let it dry. Once dried, then do the final sanding. That will ensure that once you start using it and introduce moisture to the board, the grain will not lift again. For finishing, I'm using a cutting board mixture that I do myself. It's a very common mixture of mineral oil and beeswax. I did a batch of this stuff earlier and I still have many cans left, so I'll include this with the boards to my family so that they can maintain the boards and keep them usable for years to come. Applying finish to any piece that you've built is always a positive experience, and especially walnut and purple heart really pop and the end result looks great. After a few minutes I wiped off the excess and then it's done. I'm very happy how this turned out, and hopefully my brother and his wife will like it as well when they open up their Christmas presents. On to the next ones. As I mentioned, I'm building several cutting boards currently, so more to come soon. Hope you liked it and catch you on the next one.